Good evening. My name is Matt Tedeschi, and on behalf of the Young Professionals Board of the John Howard Association of Illinois, thank you so much for joining us for our second virtual event of 2021, Ballots Behind Bars, a discussion on incarceration and voting rights. This evening has been made possible by the generous support of half-year sponsor, the Prins Law Firm, our event sponsor, Lagback, Chicago's LGBTQ+ Bar Association, and our technology sponsor, Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom LLP. Thank you for supporting the John Howard Association's critical work. I'm pleased to let you know that this evening's event has already been quite successful in benefiting JHA's important work. If you haven't yet donated, you can do so at any time by using the link provided in the handout section of your screen. The John Howard Association was founded in 1901 and continues to serve as the only independent prison monitoring and reporting organization in the state of Illinois. Its mission has remained constant: to advocate for a fair, humane, and effective criminal justice system. JHA serves as the eyes and ears of the public by monitoring conditions of confinement across the state, making that information available to the public, and using the data to advocate for structural change. Tonight's conversation deals with an issue deeply connected to JHA's mission of making corrections and incarceration more just and humane. Granting incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals the ability to vote and empowering them to do so recognizes them as moral agents, maintains their connection to the wider social and political community, and allows them to play a constructive role in shaping public conversations and policy. This evening's discussion will feature a slate of fascinating speakers. We will open with a brief explanation of JHA's work from its executive director, Jennifer Vollenkatz. Then we will hear from our panelists. Renaldo Hudson is a former death row inmate and currently serves as the education director of the Illinois Prison Project, an organization fighting against excessive sentences in Illinois. Renaldo is an educator, minister, and community organizer who has helped formerly incarcerated people register to vote. Renaldo has recently joined JHA's board of directors. Juliet Sorensen is the executive director of Injustice Watch, a nonprofit journalism organization exposing institutional obstacles to justice and equality. Juliet has been a clinical professor of law at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law since 2010, where she teaches in the areas of public corruption, help as a human right, and international criminal law. Alexandria Boutros is a community organizing manager at Chicago Votes, an organization that helps engage and develop young people in Chicago. After Illinois passed the Reentering Citizens Civics Education Act, Alexandria spearheaded development of the civics curriculum for every person leaving Illinois prisons. She's currently advocating for legislative initiatives that would restore the right to vote for individuals in Illinois prisons. Our moderator tonight is Sarah Green, who has served for over 3 years on JHA's Young Professionals Board and serves on the Resource and Development Committee at JHA. Once again, you can donate at any time by using the link provided in the handout section of your screen. And without further ado, let's welcome tonight's moderator, Sarah Green.
Thanks so much for that welcome, Matt. Jenny, I'm going to turn it over to you to provide an overview regarding JHA.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. First of all, I want to say welcome to everybody for everybody who's joining us virtually. We're thrilled to have you at this event. I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I want to thank Sarah and Matt and the entire John Howard Association Young Professionals Board for putting this together and for moderating it. They put in a ton of work and it really shows, and I'm excited for the conversation. I also want to thank our panelists, Renaldo, Juliet, Alexandria, for taking the time to join us this evening and sharing your experience and expertise with all of us on this really important issue. The John Howard Association, Matt covered it really well, so that makes my job a lot easier tonight, is Illinois' only independent, not-for-profit citizen correctional organization. For 120 years, we've been going into Illinois prisons to monitor the conditions of confinement and the treatment of the people who are inside our prisons. We take this information and we bring it out to the public. We use this to fight for more transparency and to create accountability. We believe that having a system that is not only fair and safe, just and humane, but one that is transparent and accountable to the citizenry is hugely important. And one of the ways we create system change, one of the ways we push for something different and better is to make sure that people know what's going on inside our prisons right here, right now. We first came to understand some of the issues around voting rights because in Illinois, one's right to vote is restored when they leave prison. But what we came to understand is that people in detention didn't know that their right to vote was still available to them pre-conviction. And we joined with some other organizations to help inform and educate people in the Cook County Jail about the rights they had. Which then prompted us to create a flyer that a lot of people began to use, kind of a flow chart, so people could assess for themselves, do I still have this right? And if so, how do I exercise it? And that's what really kind of opened our eyes to how serious an issue this is, how important an issue it is, and how grateful, frankly, we are now that we're aware of it to our partners in the work, to groups like Chicago Votes for pushing on these issues because they are hugely important and impactful. And of course, it's when you talk to people who are in detention, in incarceration, that you begin to understand just how dear and important this right is and how important it is for us to facilitate people's access to exercise it and make sure that it's expanded and not limited. So I think that it's fantastic you guys are discussing this evening. And without further ado, I would love to hear from our experts and panelists and get into the heart of the conversation. So again, thank you all. Thank you for attending the event and organizing the event and participating in the event. And Sarah, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thanks so much. To start off the evening, we wanted to interact with our audience a bit and gauge what the perspective was of the people that are here today with a couple of polling questions. So in a few moments, I'll present a polling question, and that is approximately how many individuals do you think were disenfranchised across the U.S. correctional population in 2020? So if you could please answer and take some time to put in your guess, we'll get a consensus on what the group has, and that will help us gauge, where we stand in terms of the conversation today. Okay, so I'm getting some results. I'm going to share them with you now. It turns out the majority of people think that approximately 3 million people are disenfranchised. Pretty close, actually, close to 5.2 million individuals were disenfranchised as of 2020 as a result of their status. And what's interesting about this is 3/4 of this population is living in their communities today, actually having fully completed their sentences or remaining supervised while on parole. One more for the group. How many U.S. states do not restrict the voting rights of anyone with a felony conviction, including those in prison? So please submit your answers to this as well. Oh, sorry. See if you can fill it in. That's my apologies. Your options are 0 states, 2 states, 6 states, or 13 states. And the correct answer here is only 2 states. Maine and Vermont are the 2 states in the United States that do not restrict the rights of any incarcerated individuals. We'll be discussing in some detail later where Illinois stands on that. And so I'm going to briefly go over this chart that Jenny shared. This is the JHA flyer that Jenny referenced that was sent to individuals that were incarcerated or had previously been incarcerated, outlining how it stands in Illinois. If you're released from custody and on parole in Illinois, you do have the ability to vote in the general election. If you're in a facility or you're convicted of a crime or awaiting sentencing, you do not. And you can find more detail on this, as well as what was distributed to people on JHA's website. But that has definitely been enough talking on our end. So we want to transfer it over to the panelists that we have here today. And with that background in mind, I'd like to discuss, the challenges that this population faces in understanding their rights and accessing resources related to voting. As you can see in this chart here, incarcerated Americans report much higher rates of political alienation. So with that in mind, Renaldo, my first question is for you. What do you feel are some of the practical barriers to voting that formerly incarcerated people often face, whether that be knowledge, transportation, technology, whatever comes to mind?
Well, actually, it's all the above. Like, you really can't cut any of that out. Technology and having an understanding of how to use technology is a major issue. Information, like when I was incarcerated, we could watch the news, but we were given a selective channel. So it wasn't like we could have a variety of access. And so when you restrict people's access to information, you almost turn them, and people sometimes are offended when I say this, you enslave people, because one of the major things that happened during slavery was one simple thing. Don't let them learn to read. If they can't read, they can't think about voting. And the same thing exists in 2021, right? My vote is connected to empowering me. So one of the other burdens is a lack of education. There's not a lot of education opportunities. And so if I'm basically struggling with how to read and write, how can I distinguish the difference between a congressman and a senator? This is why, once again, education versus incarceration. I'm big on sharing with people. We have to figure out how to knock that wall down that still exists between understanding the rights of a pretrial detainee versus a convicted felon, right? Pretrial detainees, we can get into that later. So a major burden, I think, is one, the lack of education, access to proper information, right?
Yeah.
And then people understand that there's stake in deciding who is actually being or running for office, because state's attorneys run for office, judges run for offices. So most of those that are incarcerated might want to know, hey, what is this person's view?
Absolutely. And Alex, I believe Chicago Votes has been involved recently with initiatives to spreading the word and getting this population some information, or more appropriate information. Can you share some of the initiatives that you've been involved in and what that impact has been?
Yeah. When we started really addressing this notion of so many people in community getting out of prison or currently incarcerated, or family members just in communities that are highly criminalized, not knowing about these voting rights, or spreading this narrative that anyone with a felony on their record has lost their right to vote. We started just doing Unlock. So one of our programs at Chicago Votes is our Unlock Civics program, where we're working to dismantle the barriers that exist for folks that have records in knowing what their voting rights are and ways they can be civically engaged. And so one of the ways we wanted to make sure to spread the word and dismantle this narrative is just through canvassing and through talking to people and through developing flyers with the Chicago Lawyers Committees for Civil Rights that have like Know Your Rights flyers. I think the ACLU created one as well that we've been disseminating at different events in communities, at resource fairs, really wherever, we know there's going to be people that have been touched and impacted by our American legal system, and really just continuing to change the narrative in different ways, whether that's through creative works or through our social media or through trainings, or just saying it out loud wherever we are. And through our voting in jails bill that we passed in 2019, that mandated structures for voting in jails across the state. We also mandated education about the right to vote for folks with a record to be posted in parole offices and probation offices. And so the implementation of that is something that, we're still continually working on, but that is happening, and that is a place for folks getting out of prison to see their voting rights as well. So really just trying to get the message out there to people. And I've definitely been on several canvases where, I talked to a couple different people and they really just did not know that folks with a felony have a right to vote, and then that information spreads, through community. So it's exciting.
Absolutely. And in terms of getting to a little bit more of what Renaldo was saying in regards to, judges being in an election that people could potentially have an impact in. Juliet, I wanted to ask about some background on the judicial election guide that Injustice Watch offered. Could you provide an overview of what that was for the audience and why there was then a deliberate effort to distribute that to Cook County Jail in Chicago?
Sure. Let me start by saying thank you so much to JHA for having me. I'm really happy to be part of an event to support this worthy organization. So Injustice Watch began producing judicial elections guides in 2016. And it did so because it perceived what I'm going to call a need and an opportunity. The need is the lack of information on a critically important set of public officials, a huge number of them. The Cook County Courts is one of the largest unified court systems in the country. And yet, elected judges are relatively obscure. It's rare that they are in the media spotlight. And frankly, even practicing lawyers who spend every day in the Cook County court system or close to it are hard-pressed to make an educated vote about judges running for retention or seeking election. So Injustice Watch decided that it was going to produce a thorough, deep dive, nonpartisan, non-endorsing judicial elections guide about every single candidate on the ballot. And we've done that in every election year since 2016. Now, last year, for the first time, the Cook County Jail became an Illinois Board of Elections voting site, thanks to the efforts of good folks like Chicago Votes. And detainees who are eligible to vote don't have access to our digital guide. So we determined that we were going to create a print edition of the guide and work specifically to deliver it to voters inside the Cook County Jail. So I think that's responsive to your question on background.
Yes, absolutely. And so then can you share a little bit about what happened when you attempted to disseminate those copies and some of the resistance that was received, or hiccups, if you will?
Yes, of course. So I anticipated that we were going to have to dot our I's and cross our T's. A lot of rules in jails, and I don't have a problem with that. So for months, and I mean months in advance, I worked with the policy team at the Office of the Cook County Sheriff to determine the proper way to deliver print versions of the guides. I was told that the correct way to do so was simply by direct mail. We then actually tried to cross-reference the detainees inside the jail with registered voters on Board of Elections websites and identified 1,000 names of inmates inside the jail to receive print versions of our guide. We're a small nonprofit ourselves, so we actually hosted a community-based, socially distanced, masked outdoor guide envelope stuffing party in Ping Tom Park. I, along with my daughter and her little red wagon, we lug 1,000 copies of the guide to the mailbox, mail them off, and a week later I received a phone call from the sheriff's policy director informing me that the guides, all 1,000 of them, had been rejected by the jail's mailroom. The reason that they had been rejected, I'm just going to say it at the outset, was based on a wrong legal assumption, which was that the printed guides were contraband because they were newspaper. They were printed on newspaper, they were news media. Now, it's an incorrect assumption of the law that the Cook County Sheriff and everybody at the jails should know full well, because in 2016, they were the subject of a federal lawsuit suing the jail for the jail's blanket ban on newspapers and news material. And Judge Connelly here in Chicago ruled that the First Amendment is not only freedom to speak, it is also freedom to read, and that blanket ban was overbroad and impermissible. Apparently, the mailroom in the jail didn't get the memo. And so, to our incredible disappointment, all 1,000 copies poured back into our mailbox. Here's the silver lining. The sheriff, not all units in the jail had concluded early voting. So we were able to return some of the guides, which were delivered by hand by the Cook County Sheriff's Police, to those units that hadn't yet done early voting. We then distributed the remainder of the print guides to communities throughout Cook County that were disadvantaged by the digital divide and would have more difficulty accessing the digital version of our guide. So that's the end of the story, but it's a pretty unfortunate one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess to the group, this is really for anybody. Do you feel that incidents or incidents like this that you have heard are indicative of a larger resistance to providing people held in custody with their legal rights or information on their legal rights? Have there been other examples or things that you have seen that are representative of that as well?
Yeah, like it's a common tactic, right? If they declare it contraband, then it begins to go through a process that immediately delays the delivery. And so that's a common practice in corrections, not just in the Cook County Jail, but in the Illinois Department of Corrections. A lot of you all probably remember the big thing with the books censors, in Danville Correctional Center, and how power unchecked can just decide Huckleberry Finn is an offense to us and it's a security risk, so I'll ban it, or a mother reading to her baby. Imagine a book that says knowing who to vote for is showing up, in a space in which people are conditioned to be dependents, right? And not independent. You notice that as long as your children are dependent, they can't vote and they're not responsible as adults. Well, imagine in the state of Illinois, every person incarcerated is conditioned to be a dependent, not independent.
And Renaldo, you've been involved in after being released and getting that word out quite a bit. Can you share some of the experience you've done since you've been released and how you've taken that to heart?
Absolutely. Like, I love Chicago Vote because, like, from the moment I came home, I read my clemency release, Governor Pritzker, who is the wonderful governor that I love, right? But when I read his order of my commutation, it stated that all of my rights were restored to me. And so it popped in my head immediately, hey, I can vote. I didn't know, and I'm just going to be really transparent about this. I didn't know that in Illinois, I already had the right to vote when I walked out of prison. It wasn't his words that it gave me my right to vote back to me as a released citizen from incarceration. However, in my zeal and excitement, those words and reading them was really empowering to me. And so I wanted to share with all of my peers, hey, how dare you be free and not vote? Because all the people we're crying about that's doing us wrong are waiting for you not to vote so they can talk crazy and restrict you. Like we're seeing there's in Florida, just a perfect example, because of a bad election, we have people restricting critical race theory, just for people understanding systemic racism, right? Understanding how our systems unchecked really go amok, and it stripped people of the ability to really, really express who they want to represent them, from state government to federal government. So there have been a lot of great strides in increasing awareness and information access from nonprofits like Chicago Votes and
Justice Watch and efforts of individuals like yourself, Renaldo, excuse me. But there's always going to be more action to be taken. So I'd like to shift to discussing some of the past and ongoing examples of some of what your organizations are doing, both legislative and otherwise. And to start with, Alex, do you think you can provide an overview of kind of the legislative process that has resulted in successful bill passages? One that we'll discuss in particular, but kind of just what that looks like at a high level.
Yeah. So in Illinois, just the general legislative process is that our session runs every single year from January to May 31st. And that's how session's supposed to run. Through COVID, things have definitely looked very different. And the process is in January. If you have an idea or language that you can partner with a legislator, either a representative or a senator in either chamber that will carry your language and the issue that you care about. Say you start it in the House of Representatives, then it has to go through a committee, specific committee about that issue area. It has to go to the full floor of representatives. It needs to be voted then to the Senate, with a senator to carry it over there in a committee and on the Senate floor, and then to the governor's office. And so that is a lot of steps, and there's a lot of people that need to be okay and willing to push through the bill. And if there is some sort of opposition, it can definitely be something that can stop your bill if not addressed. And so, and depending on who you're working with. And so, having a really wonderful sponsor is one of the biggest keys to passing legislation, a sponsor that really cares about the bill. You know, many of these representatives and senators have literally hundreds of bills that they file, and they end up having to prioritize maybe no more than 15 or 20 of them to actually get them passed. And so having a legislator that is planning to prioritize that work and that can work with you to make sure there's noise around that bill, to make sure what is the strategy to get it through. Are there specific legislators that might be against that bill? How do we either work with their constituency to push them on that, or how can we maybe work around that legislator so we maybe don't need their support? Our legislative session, basically, I'll just say the way it works is that if you have legislators that are on board and prioritizing it, the rules don't matter. You know, the rules matter until they don't in the Illinois legislature. And so basically all that to say is never give up while you're doing the work, especially because in Illinois, we do have session every year. And I do think that we're having more and more legislators come on board that are interested in pushing progressive legislation.
And one of the most
recent,
yeah, absolutely. That's extremely helpful. And one of the successes, at least, that we've seen in the past was the Reentering Citizens Civics and Education Act. And I think you were pretty heavily involved in that. And there was an interesting aspect of it. The peer-to-peer aspect of the act seemed to be pretty important. So can you describe the educational programming that act required and what it now is doing, and then why that peer-to-peer aspect was such a big portion of it?
Yeah, definitely. And the work of the Civics in Prison Act was written by folks that are currently incarcerated at Stateville Prison. So it really came out of the main desire to have their rights restored to vote and to be able to really have that power to, over elected officials, to make things right in the prison system. And a place to start was with the civics in prison, and just start with education of folks on the inside as they're being released. And so this bill mandates 3 civics courses for folks that are getting out of prison that are peer taught. Specifically, so, you know, there's when you're talking about democracy and voting rights and all these things can really be lost because it's like, I'm about to leave prison. This is not what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about housing. I'm thinking about mental health, family, a job, and so how do you take information about democracy and the right to vote and really connect it to all of those things that are primary on someone's mind as they're leaving prison? And we really saw the only people that can do that are folks that are also experiencing incarceration, that maybe already see that connection and can put all of the civic curriculum that we created also in partnership with Precious Blood Ministries, which is just a really amazing group of folks that are mostly all formerly incarcerated, to help us develop the curriculum. But knowing that the curriculum is not enough, you need someone to bring it to life and to be able to look at things and look at the audience of, who's in the course at that time and know this is actually what's going to stick. This is the anecdote I should share. When I'm talking some of the curriculum that goes in hand in hand with the Civics in Prison bill, talks about no taxation without representation. And we really did a whole activity where we break down where all of our state and federal taxes are going, right? And seeing that most of the taxes, a lot of them are going to medical and healthcare, and understanding, well, that doesn't make sense if we don't even have universal healthcare. Like, where is that money going? And really starting to have those conversations inside and really starting to think about that. But it's really important to note that we did pass this in 2019. So it went into effect January 2020, and they had just started training all of their peer educators, and then COVID happened. And so the courses definitely couldn't happen, whereas folks getting released were definitely getting the civics packets, but we're definitely still trying to figure out, as they have more technology and tablets and there's teaching going on tiers, how can we, and on decks, how can we still get this information to people in a safe way? And we recently just passed Senate Bill 2116, which edited the Civics in Prison bill a little bit specific to IDJJ, so our juvenile detention center. So that way, the young people that are detained in our IDJJ facilities will have a co-facilitator who is an adult that can help them work through all of the curriculum and give that to their peers. And ideally, that co-facilitator is one of our civic leaders who is also formerly incarcerated and has experience inside of, juvie. So that is the Civics in Prison law.
Awesome, thank you. And Renaldo, did you go? I know there's another bill that you guys have going on right now, and we'll get to that in a second. But Renaldo, did you experience any sort of programming like this, just from a firsthand? Can you speak to the effectiveness of it, or what you have gone through in terms of making yourself more aware or providing that information to other people?
Yeah, well, just for the record, not as a self-promotion, I actually produced a very progressive program in the Illinois Department of Correction called the Building Block. And so a groundbreaking program, just for the record, right? But one of the things we actually had, which is access to that information, I just didn't know that it belonged, and was produced by some of my peers in Stateville. And so we actually, within the Building Block program, began to use the material because we had a class called Know Your Constitution, right? And so I was trying to figure out how to actually put a class together to teach people Know Your Constitution. And then they came through with this package and just gave it to us. And it wasn't a lot of training. I'm like, ooh. And so all I did, I'm big on recycling. I just changed the name and said, Know Your Constitution. And so the information, because I'm also a certified peer educator, so I understand exactly what she said when you talk about the peers are really the best to share the information, because when I look at my peers that were incarcerated with me, they couldn't really fake with me like they could fake with someone else that just came in. And so I could hey man, when we get through talking all that other stuff, right? And use language and lingo that they understand. And so, and then giving them this information. For example, hey, not only, when you talk about the right to vote, you also have a right to grieve. Like you can file a grievance. You have a right, begin to understand that if I can protest against my country, I clearly can file a grievance against corrections. And so understanding your rights and understanding how they're all connected to voting, like to go back briefly to a question you asked, like, so what I always did from being in prison and since I've been out is every conversation I have with someone that pop into my head, they're not voting, I'll turn the conversation to, at the next election, we're going to the polls together. And so one of the things I'm doing now is I know, for example, a bunch of young people that time for election, they're all going to be 18. And so I'm going to try to get them in their whole classes, right, and take them to the polls. And that's the kind of stuff, just to answer that question earlier, that I went on the rabbit trail about, right? Now going back to this, so yes, we got a chance to use the information up until COVID hit and shut everything down. But it's a really, really good package of information. And I have an idea even now to reinstitute it. So we'll talk about that a little later, because I do think it's important for us to utilize all our resources to keep reminding people this is what makes us great, is when we can share with each other how to be better and how to exercise our constitutional rights.
Absolutely. And we've talked a lot about, everything that is going on within the prisons. And currently in Illinois, unless they're going to be released in the near future, people within prisons are not able to vote. But previously in our poll, there are some areas in the country where even if you're a prisoner, you still have the right to vote in certain elections. So, Alex, I know that Chicago Votes is currently working on a bill dealing just with this issue, HB 1872, which would restore the right to vote for people in prison in Illinois. So can you elaborate on any more detail on what that would do and how that would work logistically, if you're aware? And then also, how people tonight watching could support that if they care deeply about it.
Yeah, we are very, very excited about this legislation. We're very excited about the momentum that we've really gotten to see behind voting in prison, right? So the first piece of legislation that we worked on was the voting in jail to mandate structures for voting across Illinois in jails. And now we would like to make sure that folks don't lose their right to vote while they're incarcerated. And currently our Illinois constitutions, the plain language says that someone's right to vote shall be taken away when they're convicted and shall be restored not later than release. So that not later than release in the Constitution is giving the legislature flexibility to restore that right to vote for folks before release, and so that is what we're specifically working with in trying to make sure that the legislature also understands, kind of, rather than like going through a full constitutional amendment, which for folks you need more folks to vote yes on it in the legislature, and then you need the people to vote yes on it on a ballot referendum, which is a very, very large undertaking, to say the least, especially if you're thinking about a statewide ballot referendum that a lot of legislators and people don't want, frankly. And so if we can avoid that, that's best. However, folks would still have to lose their right to vote for a certain amount of time to be in line with our Constitution. And so working with folks that are formerly incarcerated, thinking through what's the best timing for that. And in Illinois, we have automatic voter registration. So how can that system aid in the process of, though folks are taken off the rolls when they're convicted, within 14 days, that's usually when folks are going through intake, post-conviction in IDOC, can we be putting those people back on the voter rolls within 14 days and restore that right to vote? And so that is it's a constitutional workaround that has never been brought to the legislature. And so it's definitely something hard to swallow, I think, and like take a step back and accept for a lot of folks. I think especially this constitutional piece about this, is it constitutional or not to give people the right to vote in prison? I think literally it is, we believe, and through our work with several attorneys, I think that there's definitely still stigma around having people in prison vote. And I think that's the opposition that we're really seeing, is not like, how do you make it happen? Because if the legislature votes it through, state agencies will have to make it happen. And so at this point, in the end of session, the reason I say that in the Illinois legislature rules matter until they don't is because we were able to see our bill taken from HB 1872 and then finding a new bill, SB 828, that as a vehicle that our bill could actually be moving through the last couple of days. Minding this is after committee deadlines, after House floor deadlines, because it was something that the Speaker is in favor of. So it's good to know that the Speaker of the House, Speaker Welch, is very much in favor of voting in prison. And we were able to get 63 representatives to commit to voting yes on this bill. And there are definitely some legislators that maybe aren't quite ready yet, and all they need is pressure. I think they need some pressure to say, hey, don't use this constitutionality piece as an excuse to not push this forward. And it's really wonderful because we've had some, like logistically speaking, the Clerks Association and the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice have just been very, very collaborative with us in terms of like, how do we actually make this happen? Especially the Association of the Clerks has just been really wonderful in thinking through like, who's responsible for all of the vote by mail ballots? Who's responsible? How can we do ballot drop boxes in a way that is successful, you know, and thinking through all of the really administrative pieces of it. When we think through voter education, how can we make sure that, you know, knowing that over 60% of folks in our prisons are from Cook County or Chicago, how can we make sure that they potentially have access to Injustice Watch voter guides? Because those are definitely some of the people that likely were scorned by a lot of judges and put away behind bars for lifetime, and now don't even have a say over that injustice. And so what can people do to support voting in prison? Just be in support of it and follow Chicago Votes on social media. And when we put out calls and asks to pressure a legislator, just send a tweet or file a witness slip, and it really goes a long way. We are really looking forward to a summer event where we're going to be doing a screening of our Voting in Prison documentary in a park, so folks can come and eat popcorn and watch our documentary that the wonderful Renaldo is in. We have a big old inflatable screen, and just having events where we're talking about the right to vote for people in prison and really normalizing it as something like, yeah, this is what Illinois is going to do. That is the direction we're going in. Everyone's on board, so let's go.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds fantastic. On a slightly shifting gears a little bit, you mentioned Injustice Watch's guide. You know, Injustice Watch is a nonpartisan organization. JHA is a nonpartisan organization. Julia, a question for you. You know, these issues can really divide people in terms of how they feel, at least across the country, perhaps in communities. How does Injustice Watch draw the balance between being a nonpartisan organization that reports on the successes and failures of voting rights and voting rights legislation, while also maintaining sort of, like I said, that neutral balance, particularly when people have such staunch opinions on the issue. Waiting for Juliet. Renaldo, I will ask you that question. Would you like to speak to that documentary that Alex was referencing? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it is a really awesome documentary about silenced, which is the most appropriate language, because you silence people when you take their right to vote, right? When you take the Constitution and put it in front of people and then says, this doesn't apply to you because you're in jail. In America, in the same space, right? But all of a sudden, because of some language, right, you become less than a citizen, right? I think people are easily can get to the place of saying, hey, I'm accountable for my actions. That's why I went to prison. But I'm also a citizen. And these are the rights of a citizen. And I love the fact that the documentary is revealing the humanity of incarcerated citizens, because that's usually what gets lost. And it becomes so much easier for people when they say they're monsters. They don't deserve the right to vote. And so people erase, the fact that I still have my humanity no matter what I do. And I'm still a citizen no matter what I do. I should be held accountable. I'm big personally on accountability and responsibility, but I also recognize that to those much is given, much is required. And so how could a country that is so rich in knowledge be so poor in sharing it with a portion of the population? And this documentary helps us to share the story that people are remembering. Chicago Vote is giving voice to the voice broken. And so I love the fact that we're able to speak to not only legislators who we pray hear us now, like watch this video and remember that you can decide that I'm going to make America great by giving people the right to vote. So the documentary is talking about that. I support it. I'll be out there. Make sure you let me know when we go short in the park. And I challenge 1,000 people to show up. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely understand the need to humanize the population and get people to gravitate towards this feeling that everybody deserves this right. But reverting back to the previous question, it is a partisan issue for many, right? People have staunch opinions on it. Juliet, I don't know if you heard me previously. I'll repeat the question in case. How does Injustice Watch, that reports on these issues, balance kind of that nonprofit, nonpartisan organizational structure while covering material that may lean one way or the other on the political spectrum?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, well, let me start by saying that we at Injustice Watch seek to tell stories that are not otherwise told. Those are stories about systemic injustices and inequities. But we do so with the highest standards of journalism. And my editorial staff works hard. Again, we're making an affirmative choice to produce these guides, to report on judges who might otherwise operate without any light shined upon them and their impactful decision-making that affects personal liberties and affects communities across Chicagoland and Cook County. But we do so in a thorough way. As I said, our guide does not endorse, it does not give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but we do seek to include information that we deem to be relevant to somebody walking into the ballot box, into their polling place, to make an informed decision about these significant public officials. Is that nonpartisan? Well, actually, yes, because our goal is an informed citizenry, which is essential for civic engagement and meaningful participatory democracy.
we're talking about kind of just providing that aspect to allow these people to choose across the spectrum, despite the fact that they may have judges or have a different political opinion. It's really about providing that information in an effective way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I would take a step back and say that, again, even a well-informed consumer of news, even somebody who regularly works in the Cook County courts, they're influenced by, again, the choices of what stories are reported in the first instance. When the two founders of Injustice Watch made the decision to have a judge's beat, to report on Cook County judges, to tell the story that eviction court had no court reporters in it in Cook County until last year for budgetary reasons, but the majority of defendants in eviction court are unrepresented, not able to advocate for themselves in challenging circumstances, and there's no record of that. Nobody else is telling those stories. And so really it is the mission that's at the heart of journalism. It's determining what is newsworthy, and then it is seeking to inform the public. And in that sense, it is empowering the public ultimately to make their own decisions as voters.
Do you think that there is a way, and this is a question for the group too, and Renaldo touched on this with talking about, just touching on the humanity of these individuals and how the fact that they're citizens, like how do we frame these issues in a way that would appeal to somebody that tends to maybe lean more conservative on criminal justice issues in a way that is effective? And that's to the group and whoever feels comfortable.
And I think it's, Renaldo, you can definitely speak to this a good amount. I know you're probably going to say something similar maybe, but I mean, it's really breaking down like who is in prison. I think it's so much easier to not think about this and have that kind of opinion when you're able to just like dehumanize and just say felons or convicted murderers and like use those types of words. I think when we start even changing our own words and saying people that are in prison, mothers that are in prison, vets, veterans that are currently incarcerated, and starting to talk about veterans that have their right taken away from them after supposedly serving for this country, or mothers that cannot fully advocate for their children because their right to be has been taken away. Renaldo.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you. You're absolutely right. One of the reasons people some of my peers tease me, right? They say, Renaldo, why do you always wear ties and nice shirts to events? And what I always learned, and I've never forgotten this, is that optics are everything to people, right? Oftentimes, it's a shame that we have to look a certain way. We have to sound a certain way, right, to be appreciated. However, what we can't do, and this is what I take personally, what I can't do is say, okay, I'm not going to do those things, right, because I shouldn't have to. Well, I'm saying I'm going to put on the tie and remind people that I'm a decent human being, right, that I could look just like your uncle, just like your father, just like your grandfather, and I should be treated as such. And if your grandfather was in prison, your uncle, your father, would you want him to vote? If your mother and your grandmother or your daughter, would you want them to vote? And so when people can see things that are unthreatening, and that's why I use that language continually about humanize people, right? When people say, hey, you don't look that scary. In fact, I didn't expect you after 37 years of incarceration to come out and not be beastly. Why do you talk so well? I thought I just talked. I didn't know I talked so well. But those are stigmas, right? There are so many brilliant men and women in prison that are just waiting for an opportunity to say, hey, see me, hear me, know that I matter, and I want to be a part of making society much better. I think, and I don't mean this boastfully, I think I'm a pretty humble person, but I think society is so much better with me free. I just think that. I think that when people recognize and they see my smile and they say, well, if you came home before COVID, you would smile more. No, I smile because I now have the ability to speak for so many thousands of people that wouldn't have voice without people like me deciding to say, I will remember what I left behind and I won't rest until it changed.
In terms of
Please go ahead, Juliet. Go ahead.
No, I was actually just going to pick up on something that Renaldo said earlier in terms of what is a partisan or a nonpartisan issue. Renaldo mentioned the importance of personal responsibility. And, it seems to me that regardless of one's political leanings or party, personal responsibility is a critical part of what somebody might call being an informed citizen, engaging in society, and taking that civic engagement seriously. So to my mind, being able to vote, whether or not a person is incarcerated, is totally consistent with Unlock Civics and the civics education programming that Illinois has so recently supported. And it has nothing to do with partisanship. It's about individual and collective responsibility for the good of our body politic and society.
And drop the mic on that one.
I was about to say that was a very, very fitting way, I think, to come to kind of the end of the program. We are coming across on like the last 3 minutes of the time that we have together. And we did want to save some time for Q&A. I do have one question I think that came in that I think is really interesting, and then I'll turn it over to Matt to close the show. But for anybody that chooses to answer, the question is, how would you say voting participation among the currently or previously incarcerated population varies between the different types of elections, presidential, midterm, primary, local, and how have your organizations, taken that into account? I think, the judicial election guide is obviously a very particular area of focus. Have you seen that kind of variation across those different avenues of voting?
With young people at Chicago Votes, we definitely see higher turnout in presidential and midterm elections, specifically presidential, and then some of the lowest turnout during municipal elections. And that is specifically, and I think very much in part to Renaldo was talking about, is education, right? There's much, much more just like public news and speak and noise about presidential elections than there is about, the mayoral municipal elections. And so it's about education, how are we educating our citizens, our registered voters, what role does our news play in it? And I think similar to like where Injustice Watch is like, where many of our news are not talking about judges. This is not what they're highlighting in our elections. We have a really wonderful alternative that has such important and vital information on judges to help us vote on that. And I think that's specifically why we've seen more people voting for judges as well.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we viewed last year's presidential election as a challenge, but also an opportunity. A challenge because the attention paid on the national election, was really, to some extent, sucking the air out of the room, but an opportunity because we anticipated high voter turnout. And so our goal was to disseminate our guide and amplify our reporting and our reporting's impact as much as we possibly could. And at the end of the day, 250,000 people used our judicial elections guide for the general election. And I'll just say one other thing about impact. Prior to 2018, the last time that a Cook County judge who sought retention was actually not retained was all the way back in the 1980s during Operation Greylord. If you all remember that, bribery in the Cook County courts. In 2018, and again in 2020, for the first time since that era, a sitting Cook County judge has not been retained. And I'd like to think that it's because of our guide, but also because of the collective efforts of the people who are here tonight.
Last minute, Renaldo, do you have any parting words as well?
Yeah, I would just say, first of all, I'm old enough to remember Gray Lord, and I was in the Cook County Jail in the 80s when actually the pretrial detainees actually voted for Harold Washington overwhelmingly. But I would just want to remind everyone that, all voices matter, and when you silence one of us, you really silence all of us. And that's what makes this country so great, even though people don't feel it is. Like, we get to debate these things and we get to discuss these things and we get to scratch and fight for this. And so I just want to remind everybody, like, make sure you keep your boots on, right? Because of people's inability or the unwillingness to vote, who could vote, right? We have a previous person who was in the White House who appointed so many federal judges that have lifetime positions that will have an impact on generations. And so when people think about that, I just want to remind people of how powerful your vote really is. You can determine who put people in positions for life. Think about that, not just sentence people to life, but appoint people to life, right? And so I just want to remind people our votes, our voting, and our votes really, really matter. Give the right to incarcerated citizens to breathe and express their constitutional love, whatever party they choose to vote for.
Very well said. I think appropriate way to close the show. Matt, I will be turning it over to you for some final remarks.
Sure. Thank you. And a big thank you to all of our speakers for taking the time to share your insights with all of us tonight. We greatly appreciate learning from you, Juliet, Alex, and Renaldo. We are also grateful to the organizations that made this evening possible with their generous support. Our half-year sponsor, the Prince Law Firm, our event sponsor, Lagback, Chicago's LGBTQ Bar Association, and our technology sponsor, Skadden, Arp, Slate, Meager, and Flom, LLP. Thank you for supporting the John Howard Association. For our viewers, if tonight's program has inspired you to further support JHA's critical work, you can donate at any time by using the link provided in the handout section of your screen. Thank you for spending this time with us, and have a great night.